Thanks, Don. I'm always thrilled to be invited to talk, and it doesn't happen all that often, but and I'm especially delighted to come here and talk because I'm really quite immersed in my work. I have to travel a lot, and you never really I don't get the chance to think all that much about things. In fact, we fortunately, Don and I had a professor who said, you got 5 years, these 5 years that you're experiencing now to get your ideas together, because you won't have time to really move them too much farther along. And that person, I can say, is absolutely right. I still work on the ideas I formulated in 5 years of architecture back at U of T. I'm still living off those. But the point is, I don't get to talk much, and I am thrilled, and usually I accept very quickly, and then I go into a cold sweat for the period, the month, or the 2 months, or the 6 months it is between there and when I have to talk. Terrified, because I really have to figure out what I'm going to say. And usually, I mean, the last time I was here was the end of one of those cold sweat periods, and I talked about ideas that I formulated. But tonight I'm going to do something quite different, which I'm actually going to present to you work that we've worked on that we presented to the public. Because I thought, first of all, I thought, it's just the whole process of being in a position where you're working and for clients, and Leslie is in part a client on this project with the City of Toronto. We're the major client. And all the angst you go through of trying to make sure it's a completely different kind of angst. It's a hot sweat angst, not a cold sweat one, where you've got to get your ideas and get to the public and fight off all the options and try and do the best job you can to sort of translate those ideas into something that ordinary people right across the city can understand. So I'm going to present just what a sort of collection of pieces of the project to try and give you the whole picture as best I can, all of which are in slides that were presented to the public. And then just at the end, draw back and comment a bit on some of the issues that still are left hanging by the project and that are primary concerns still, but I'll be quite honest, I don't think we really addressed in the project or haven't yet. So they're out there, and I leave them with you because you've got 5 years to think about those kinds of issues before you have to start to produce. So I call the talk Big Move, Small Places. You know, the regional transit plan is called the Big Move for our region. And that's at one end of the spectrum, and the other are the actual places and properties that are affected by this. And the whole project's one that's it sort of vibrates back and forth between these two scales. And just to say that this isn't a project done by my firms alone, my firms being Planning Alliance and Regional Architects, but we also work quite closely with a firm called Brooke McElroy and with Antoine Grumbach from Paris. And those of you who know the T3 in Paris will be familiar with Antoine. He is the architect and urbanist who developed the T3, which is the new LRT around the perimeter of Paris, which is a pretty amazing piece of infrastructure if you don't know it. But also Antoine taught me in architecture in 1968 because all the sort of serious thinkers, young thinkers in Paris had to get out in the student riots. And Antoine ended up, fortunately, at U of T for a couple of years. So we've known each other a long time, and I worked with him in Paris as well. So the Eglinton LRT and the so-called Eglinton Connects project. So the LRT, it is the largest transit project in Canada for sure, and Leslie suspects maybe in North America. So we're dealing with a 19-kilometer piece of Eglinton that runs from Kennedy in the east over to Black Creek in the west. And briefly, that project is mostly the form of an odd mix, actually. It's an underground LRT. I think it was a political compromise in some respects, but it's in a subway, a drilled hole underground for most of its route, but it comes out of ground at either end, in the Scarborough portion and then the East York portion of the former York Centre portion, but basically runs under Eglinton elsewhere from over most of its length. And the project involves looking at the line as a whole, but also focusing on 6 focus areas, which are shown here, which we call focus areas. So particular points of importance for a variety of reasons along the way. So we had a sort of planning process that looked over the entire length, then at these focus areas, and then at scales, all kinds of scales in between. It's been about a year and a half, almost a 2-year process, and is concluded now and goes on to the next stage, which is for Infrastructure Ontario to take it and to develop the detailed plans and the construction documents to build it. That gives you, I mean, the other reason I thought that would be worth showing this to you is just to give you a sense of how projects like this get created and get realized, and what kind of, how they're represented to the public, just as a kind of exercise. So this is the schedule of the project, which is, as I say, basically over, or will be over in March, but most of the work has been done, and shows you the kind of staging we went through from sort of research and analysis through to the visioning of the project. You know, I have trouble with that word visioning, and you'll see the visioning document up here, but I remember Jane Jacobs said, you know, I've just been all across Canada. She was 80 years old at the time, and only time I ever met her, and I'd won an award that she was responsible for, and she said, you know, I've been going across the country meeting everybody. Everybody's talking about vision, this, and what's going to happen 5 years out and 10 years out, and nobody's talking about tomorrow. So when we talk about vision, it's sort of an idea that will change over the way. We don't treat it as a kind of fixed thing. So vision, testing our initial ideas, refining those, and then producing a kind of final report. And then just to give you a sense of the politics of it, Toronto's of course fraught by politics, but we either deal with, I think, 12 or 14 different wards and different politicians, including some who are running for mayor now, and quite a spectrum of interests from a political point of view, not to mention sort of neighborhood point of view. So one of the things we did is have open houses inside City Hall, ironically for councillors, so councillors could drop in and see up on the second floor of City Hall. And again, to be clear about the roles, who's actually building this, who's responsible for what here. Metrolinx are responsible for the LRT, the design of construction of the LRT itself, and of the stations, with some input from the city on those, especially in terms of the interface between those and what the city is responsible for and what we were responsible for the project, which is the planning and design of a new public realm and streetscape, a transportation study from Black Creek to Brinkcliff, so just to look at the impact of the new LRT on existing traffic movement on the surface, planning tools for the focus area, and the creation of ideas about zoning in a form that could be translated into a revised zoning bylaw. So quite an interesting mix of responsibilities. And Eglinton is an extremely, I mean, actually Eglinton for years, from the serious transportation people in Toronto, has always been thought to be the most important next line after Yonge and Bloor, the two existing lines. And it's taken a long time to get back to that line as being key. It is a kind of datum that runs across the city, and you can see it here. It's really, we'll probably redefine the way we talk about the city, because as you know, the city is either east of Yonge or west of Yonge at the moment. That's how people describe Toronto. Now we're going to be east of Yonge, west of Yonge, southwest, northeast of Yonge and Eglinton. You know, it's that kind of a space, and you can see that it cuts through the old part of the city in the center, so the dark areas are the older and the lighter gray are the newer. And in fact, at a kind of regional scale, it runs from Lake Ontario right to the Niagara Escarpment. So it's a very, very important, as we'll see in a moment, a very important corridor in not just the neighborhoods it runs through, not just the city, but also the region as a whole, and hence Metrolinx's involvement at one level along with the city. So one of the pieces of work we did was just on the history of the development of Eglinton, which has evolved from a country road between concession blocks, actually between two townships, in fact, to an urban main street, running as it does. It spans the city from east to west, and as I've just said, also links the Humber to the Don Valley. So one of the things we're interested in is that it actually cuts across the topography of the city, and that's an interesting phenomena that we wanted to take advantage throughout the project, and you'll start to see how we began to do that. So this just shows, those part of the series of figure grounds that show the growth around Eglinton, and Eglinton's right in the middle there. And that shows it set against the ravines and the concession roads so that you can see this real sense of it. It's really cutting a section right through the city, in fact, and will be the new Bloor or the new Yonge, and is on its way to becoming that. So one of the challenges of the project is to actually deal with also, first of all, at a client level, the fact that Metrolinx are concerned about it as a regional, almost provincial level structure. The city's concerned with it in the city, but the neighborhoods all along it are concerned about what it is their main street. So there's three different constituencies at play here. And hence, in many ways, at the regional level, it is a big move. At the neighborhood level, it's affecting their very fabric and their network of small places, if I can put it that way. And this shows it, so at the regional level and the squares around the project area, the black square in the middle, you can see how critical it is. That actually, at a regional level, it is the main street for the region in many respects. At one end, linking out to Halton and Peel and the districts beyond, the regions beyond, and at the other, out towards Durham, and then, of course, up north towards Vaughan through the other north-south connections. So it's a route or a place that people will leave the city and come to the city from, and there are obviously serious sort of gateways at either end of it. So it has a very large-scale role for the city as a whole. You can see the black lines are existing subways or comparable order transit, and the red is Eglinton. And the dotted lines there are where it goes above grade. So again, at a city level, it's really running from the lake over to the airport eventually, and the west end of it, for those of you who know it, is actually reserved to widen out as a parkway to the airport, and it'll be a second major access into the airport at that end. And then we see the fabric of neighborhoods as well, including the priority neighborhoods, which are shown in red here. And then so at that fine grain level of neighborhood, these are the series of neighborhoods which it in fact serves as a main street too, from one end to the other. So the Golden Mile, the newest end, the famous Golden Mile in Scarborough, right into the Yonge and Eglinton, which is really one of the major sort of heart of the city, through Leaside, through Forest Hill, all of whom are busy at that level trying to define, the BIAs of whom are trying to define the differences between their neighborhood from the other. So there's a kind of differentiated character that picks up too. So at one end you've got a question of language here, because on one side, and transit always raises this, by the way, that the original Yonge line was built in a very consistent language of materials and design, used the same colored tiles, it used similar fixed set of words, if I can call it that, to paint the line as a whole, whereas the later lines, the new one that runs up in front to Vaughan now, but the Bathurst line, if I can call it that, every station was differentiated from the other and built by a separate architect, and the whole idea was to sort of create a kind of different set of words at each, to recognize the difference of places and not the sameness. And I think the challenge before us here is to try and do both at this level. That's what we're actually talking about. So there's the sort of neighborhood scale street that we're dealing with, the DNA, if I can call it that, of the main street of Ontario or Canada for that matter. And this shows it in cross-section, and you can see, so the white line is the underground portion, and you can see that it crosses under both the Black Creek in the west and then the Don and Wilkett in the east, and comes up above grade where you see the white dots is where it's coming up onto ground level. And that, it's currently under construction. They've been boring from one end, and I think we'll start shortly, it's boring from the west end eastwards, and we'll start shortly at the east end at Brentcliffe near Wilkett Creek and start boring westwards, joining somewhere in the middle. And you can see that this also paints its situation within the topography of the city. So you've really got a kind of the two valleys at either end rising up to the high point, or the divide that happens actually in Forest Hill, hence Forest Hill. And we think that what we've always thought from the beginning that this is not just about transit and service, it's also connecting us with our landscape. It's more, there is that magic moment on the Yonge and Bloor lines when you burst out from underground and come in through green and then burst back in. And this will do that in two very major ways at either end. But also we wanted to try and convey the sense that it's also carrying you through this topography and carrying you up to heights. And at one point we even thought, well, I think we still think, and that's to be determined, but on the detailed design you might actually start to use the soils that it's traveling through to start to color the stations. You might actually use the trees on the street to reflect the different ecologies through which it's passing, etc. Those kinds of notions. So there is a depiction of that moment on this line where we burst out of at Brentcliffe or near the Laird area out into the Wilkett Creek, and our views of the topography there. There is the vision that was determined after much political input and many public meetings that Eglinton will become Toronto's central east-west avenue, a beautiful green, linear public place that supports residential, employment, retail, and public lands in a setting of community vibrancy. So broad it lacks meaning, but it works for many people. So, and actually, we moved, as a way of talking about it, we came around to these four different categories, if I can call them that. So one is the building of the LRT, which is actually Metrolinx's responsibility. But then there's the building of Eglinton itself. So how is the introduction of the line actually going to affect the built character of Eglinton from one end to the other? How can the corridor actually become an element of greening the city as it moves through the city? Even where it's underground, it has quite a bit of impact on Eglinton above. So there's the opportunity to actually use it as an agent of greening the city throughout. And then the whole issue of traveling. So what are we considering? It's clearly not just the LRT itself, but also pedestrian, cycling movement, buses, cars, all those kinds of, and rebalancing, if I can call it that, the traffic flow along Eglinton. In fact, just to give you an example of that, there will be a continuous 19-kilometer bike lane when this is over, which will be the longest bike lane in the city, and in many Canadian cities, you'll be able to ride from one end of the line to the other, not just drive and not just take the LRT itself. So that categorization became a way that we could describe the project. So one primary area was a new balanced mobility mix for the city, which we called Traveling Eglinton. The greening, a green avenue linking the city's ravines to each other and to the transit line itself, so that's the greening. And then new housing, jobs, shops, and opportunities, which is actually the zoning and the building portion of the building of Eglinton. So let's just show you what we did at the traveling side. So some of the major imperatives came out of the initial public process for the project, which was to create a complete street, to provide wide sidewalks and for large trees, so serious trees. As you know, most of the planning that's gone on in main streets in Toronto has resulted in piddly little trees that struggle to reach any kind of significant height. So how could we actually encourage serious large trees to grow? And how could we widen the sidewalks and improve the pedestrian space throughout? And how could we protect not only provide for biking, but provide for protected cycling lanes throughout? And also, the other challenge was to maintain the existing parking supply. So one of the problems with one of the precursors, which is the St. Clair line, is that parking got eliminated from the street certainly the rush hours, but got severely reduced, which is hugely contentious issue with shop owners along the street who lost the ability to, they were losing customers, and many of them still complain that they are. Unlike the Bloor line, which, as you know, the train was offset, so there was a whole network or linear set of parking lots that complement Danforth and Bloor throughout, which is quite a different situation. So we made a commitment to maintain the existing parking supply along the street as a whole. And one of the ways that we looked at doing that was to provide new lanes and new parking behind the existing buildings to complement, and there were still spaces in front as well, but to sort of keep that ratio up. So this just gives you diagrammatically what's really going on. There's a typical existing cross-section of Eglinton as it is, and basically it has a bus only, the 2 bus only lanes through most of its lanes at the moment, and then the 3 travel lanes, and the center turn lane, and relatively narrow sidewalks once you've got all the furniture into it. So first of all, that just to give you a sense of traffic, this is just numbers of at the AM period, what number of people are being accommodated. So in cars, you're getting 700 to 1,300 people per hour being accommodated, and in buses, 1,200 to 2,600, for a total of 2,300 to 3,600. So then, with the introduction of the LRT underground, that means we can eliminate the buses. There will be buses on some portions still linking through certain portions, but basically we're getting rid of the bus lanes because they're being replaced by the transit, obviously. And that also then allowed us to begin to look at widening the streets. So this is something that had previously, one of the reasons I'd say we were selected for the project is we were responsible originally for St. George Street, which widened the sidewalks and reduced the travel lanes, in keeping with the fact that, in fact, we did traffic counts there that included pedestrians, as were done for Eglinton, and rebalanced the street to meet the pedestrian load, because always the vehicle space taken up in the street was much bigger than the actual percentage of people using it in vehicles. So that allows us to begin to think about planting trees and introducing the cycling lanes on one side and the other, and possibly considering parking as well on one side or the other. And then that in turn allows us to improve car travel, actually the car capacity somewhat, from 900 to 1,600 people, and then to add 5,000 to 7,500 in the LRT itself. So you can see this is just trying to give you a very simple order of magnitude of increase of the capacity of the system and the street as a result of the process. So that results in a revised cross-section, so a typical cross-section that looks something like that. So we're looking at the sidewalks on the outside, the tree zone, which is also used as a pedestrian space, so we've in fact widened the sidewalk to almost 5 meters. The bicycle lanes on either side protected, and then the 4 travel lanes and or parking lanes that can be used for, depending on the particular configuration. And that cross-section was then adapted to there are different traffic conditions along Eglinton. Some parts, for instance, around the Allen are very, very busy and are already taking a lot of traffic, where there are other areas that are very quiet and don't deal with traffic. So we were able to maintain the continuity of the cross-section of the trees, of the cycling, of the traffic, but actually adapt it to varying conditions traffic-wise along the street. So these are just plans that address the different conditions that you find along it that I'm really not going to go into detail. And so there you're seeing, so where that girl is standing by the bike is kind of the edge, well actually the edge of the existing sidewalk is just beyond the pale gray area there. And you can see the expanded sidewalk out to the bike lane and then the parking outside of that. And that's a protected bike lane, so it's raised above the street surface. There's another segment, and you can see above where it is in the city, but that's Spadina to Mount Pleasant. The section that ends up being proposed for that, which keeps a turn lane in the middle, provides some parking to either side, and keeps the trees. So again, a similar condition or variation on that theme. On the greening side, again, I go back to the fact that the line is cutting through some very significant green spaces. It's also both major, that is the Wilkett and Dawn on the east and the Black on the west, but also some historic streams in the center there and other park sites that are alongside. And there you get that sort of closer look at the overlaid on the existing valley systems and green spaces. So first of all, the ravine landscape was just simply celebrating those entrances and exits to the valley. In fact, now there are stations. There is a station. There was quite a controversy over the station at the Leslie Street end, which has now been included so that the subway will actually provide access into the valleys through a stop and give people the right to and get out of the LRT and to get into the valleys, if I can put it that way. And that showed a notion of, you know, if we were bridging, how we could link the bridges down into the valley. Provide space. And then these are some notions of the portals, so the entrance points into the valleys that will be created at where it bursts out of the ground. Then the next part of the greening was actually the area of the street where this LRT is at grade, which is quite a different condition than being underground. And this is, in fact, the T3 in Paris that Antoine was involved in. So that's the street before it was built, and that shows it after. So the extraordinary thing that the tramway did was it was sold, in fact. It was a terribly contentious project. It's not just Toronto where transit's contentious. It was a very contentious project until the point where Grumbach said, look, we can actually green the right-of-way. We can plant wildflowers in it. We can introduce it as a major green space in the city, continuous green space. And there you see it in addition, and so very significant. And in fact, we had to make quite the case for doing that here. It's still, in a way, an ongoing case, but I think we're going to get a chance to test it. But this is just to show you that notion of using the transitway as a greenway is quite popular and has been used in a wide variety of other places. This is part of our propaganda to say why we should have it in Toronto, of course. And that sort of shows what that would look like. So on the top side, you get what we call the Green Mile, which is in fact the Golden Mile section, which is the longest continuous piece where the transit's in the center of the street, running down a treed median, and then the trees to either side. And then we see it running down to the Leslie station below, so running through the valley there. And I think this is just this shows you the kind of gradual buildup. Another whole aspect of the project is that it's not all just going to happen at one time. So there's a whole issue of how does it get phased? What can you introduce firstly? How can it be done additively over time as money becomes available? We gradually build up to a public space because it's a huge project that's already, I think, got a $5 billion budget, just basically around the basic infrastructure and the transit. So to begin to sort of make an argument for adding public amenity here is a challenge. And the way we address that is to say this is something that can happen over time. The Parisian one is probably, per mile, is probably 4 times the cost of what we have to spend here, just to be clear. So this just shows a sequence of how the street would be built up. So there we see the transitway down the middle. Well, that's actually the existing situation today. That shows the introduction of the transitway at the outset, and the bike lanes to either side, the wider sidewalks, the tree planting, the greening of the centerpiece, the median, the introduction of trees, the notion that those will in turn catalyze new development along either side, because as you'll see in a moment, we're also rezoning the lands along either side for intensification or higher density use, so that we get a final, and also using the stations themselves, the platforms, as green. I didn't tell the end of the story in Paris, but the one move was the promise that the tramway would be an agent of green. But the big promise that was made was that you will wait for the tramway under trees. So you can see that what is actually going to happen here is that the roofs will be taken out once the trees are big, and you will be, in fact, waiting under trees. And this is one of the stations along it. And then some sense of just how that greening relates to other green spaces in the city, where it would, in fact, provide, just on that one section there, the 13.5 acres, and how that compares with other open spaces in the city and other cities that we know. So finally then there's the street itself, the main street, if I can call it that, and there are the opportunities there for greening, where with the street greening, the space, open space around the stations that we worked with Metrolinx on and are still working on, and the open space within new development, and the open space, the existing open spaces, and how to link those into this whole system. So we've talked about the main street itself and how that should emerge. And there's a whole piece of work that was done on enlarging the planting areas for trees, making a proper base so that trees could grow to a much greater height, to a more normal height, by through different practices. Making use of these open space, these kinds of open spaces, trail systems, skating areas, whatever, public open spaces along the way, linking those in with the street itself, extending the greening of the street to adjacent properties. And then the stations, and this is the Allen station, sorry, which would be or some preliminary work on the Allen station at Allen and Eglinton, and showing what it might look like and from the air. So you can see that it involves pieces of land on both sides of Eglinton, and you get a sense there of that those will also be very special public spaces. And I think our notion was, which is yet to be evolved, but these would be a series. So there are a series of stations, there are a hierarchy of station, there's a matching hierarchy of public spaces associated with each station, all of which can evolve over time. And so you'll get, as has happened on the Young Line, the major regional stations happening first, some of the major city stations along with them, then the smaller city stations, and then the interim stations. And at each point, an open space is included along with the station. And then how those station sites could be planned to evolve over time, along with the station itself. And there's a whole issue about the stations, and are they finished primary structures that remain intact as stations, or are they simply starter stations that then can get absorbed into the density that's going to likely come to the station over time? Another kind of major issue that's being dealt with at a station level. And then how do we make sure that new green spaces are added with the new public places that are developed with the development alongside the street? In terms of building Eglinton, that is the zoning, if I can call it for that, for the street. The city's objective from the beginning was to use Eglinton as a agent for the introduction of mid-rise building. And this is another major and evolving issue throughout the project. So the notion was in the beginning, in fact, zone the entire street for mid-rise development only. That is, in fact, development, the height of which is defined by the width of the street itself, which in fact then means there'll be 5 hours of sunlight on the far side of the street from any development, which is a kind of basic rule the city followed in its mid-rise guidelines. What's happened throughout is we've realized that the street is a very diverse place, and there are actually some areas that probably shouldn't be touched or are unlikely to develop at all, or already have some integrity from a heritage point of view. There are other areas where mid-rise might work, but clearly around the stations and other areas, there's a real need to introduce density to take advantage of the transit itself, and also to help pay for the transit indirectly by raising the value of the land and the tax benefits from that for the city over time. So the city, the evolution has evolved from a kind of mid-rise to a variety of heights. At the beginning, you can see the yellow areas were the mid-rise areas that we were asked to look at in detail, and we're looking at a typical mid-rise building there and other typical mid-rise buildings that were touted by the mid-rise study that introduced this to the city in the first place. In fact, what happens in the end is we're saying there'll be mid-rise in those mixed-use areas, that is largely between stations. There'll be locations where building height should be limited, and that is because of heritage or they have some other value at the heights they're at now, or more or less. And there also should be locations for tall buildings, which tend to be around the stations themselves, and we'll see in a moment at some of the focus areas which focus on particular station sites. So the notion of mid-rise is exactly expressed in this diagram, where you get to build basically 6 stories. Well, again, it's all related to the width of the street. So in a 27-meter right-of-way, which is the average right-of-way for the street here, the maximum building height is the same 27 meters. And above the 6th row, there's an angular plane of 45 degrees that ensures that light falls on the far side, the sidewalk on the far side of the street, 5 hours a day. The street wall can be a maximum of 80% of the allowed height. So there are the sun diagrams of the street over time, and as I say, the rule being that you've got to get at least 5 hours of sunlight on the sidewalks at all time. And then there's a whole issue of the relationship of the mid-rise to the lower density neighborhoods behind, and that's governed by an angular plane from the far side of the rear property line, or the inside of a lane if such exists, and certain setbacks that ensure that light gets to the properties behind. And then there was a notion of, so we have a servicing and parking issue. So there's, in fact, if you looked at the zoning volumes and maxed them out, we could be potentially adding 400 to 500,000 people along this line, just to give you a sense of the densities we're talking about. So that's going to involve a lot of new building, a lot of new servicing and parking. And there's also a sub-notion of introducing lanes that evolve over time as in association with a new building. So you could designate the lane, start off with a new lane, which you see here on the mid-rise site, going through to a rear lane as the beginning, but eventually resulting in a permanent public lane in the back, which at least could be used for servicing, could also be used for parking. So that's part of the evolutionary process. And that gives you just a sense of that mid-rise zoning applied, and this model was applied along the entire street to give you, just to begin to illustrate what that eventual form could look like given the varying lot sizes on either side and varying conditions of the street. So that model was created, and you can see there are already certain buildings in the lower left-hand side there that already exceed that, which is an interest, and we'll come back to that, I think, as I get to the end of the talk. But it gives you some sense of the work that was done and those big slopes back to the neighborhoods behind. So there are neighborhoods where there's a 4-story maximum being set because the BIA is insisting on it. There's a whole sort of character issue of the character of the neighborhood is thought to rest with the heights and building types in those areas. There are shallow lot depths there as well, so you can't really build much higher, and the character areas require that kind of massing or that DNA. And then there are other areas where taller buildings, and this is particularly true of major intersections, where of course there are stations where taller buildings would be permitted and could be permitted, also with their own angular planes in terms of light access to the street. And that was a kind of, the diagram, sort of key diagram would come up at corner situations where mid-rises were at corners, where there were mid-rise corners, if I can call it that, what the kind of conditions would be in those situations. So there's 38.4 kilometers of total building frontage on Eglinton, and about 39% of that is appropriate for mid-rise in the end. 30% is in the focus areas, and I'll show you those in a moment, what the sort of ideas for those, and are appropriate for a mix of buildings, so they could be low-rise, could be mid-rise, but could also be high-rise. And the whole notion of making sure that we make stations, at least the city's point of view, is that you make stations that can be integrated into buildings later on and put the money, so limit the money that's spent on those up front and wait for them to be developed as part of the larger buildings. Because, in fact, many of the stations, for those of you who know the Yonge line, I get on at Summerhill Station, actually in 1954 was set up as a temporary station. Even the Rosedale Station is a temporary station, as it was thought then, because it would be under a building eventually. And there are many buildings that have been built over those sites since 1954. But so rather than go into sort of trying to make an architectural kind of statement, as is being made on the Bathurst line or the Allen line, the notion was to actually use the stations to catalyze growth rather than restrict it. So this just gives you a sense, and we could talk about all of these in a lot of detail, but just gives you a sense of what density might look like at the focus area. So this is in the West Side Mall. It's on the west side where there's actually that orange bar to your right is in fact a GO station. There's a GO line meets the LRT at that point, so it's a very high transfer point, lots of people, and lots of potential for long-term density and a mix of uses, such as is depicted here. And a sense of what that might look like. So again, that's trying to paint a kind of final version of that. This is going to happen over many years, but you've got to look at the kind of final version to know how to get started. And you can see that idea too of making sure that a park is established right from the beginning. It's open space and association, so that tone is set right from the beginning as part of the infrastructure of the line. So that view, we go to Dufferin in Eglinton, and note that's looking to the northwest, up Vaughan Road there, that comes in at an angle at that point, as you know, or probably know if you know the area. And the notion that density could extend up to Dufferin Street, because that's the potential new greenway that's being established along that former rail track there. So again, a mix of higher and mid densities. A look from Eglinton and Dufferin looking west. Bayview site, which is now big shopping center on the northwest corner, plaza on the northeast corner, but also a point of entry into the valley system, and Leaside High School grounds there, which are a major potential asset. Laird, which is in fact an employment area. So this is deemed to be the employment being kept along the Eglinton frontage, and then potential residential set inside that. Don Mills, potentially very dense site, right. So we're looking at the Science Center in the lower side of the slide here. Another major entrance into the valley system from that station, as well as access to higher density sites around the corner. And then a sort of different approach, a more sort of fabric approach related to the Golden Mile as a strip, because it's quite an extensive piece of ground. So we're seeing that in the center of the blue circle there. In fact, the orange square is the Golden Mile site that runs from Victoria Park all the way over to Birchmount. And that shows how that site's developed since 1951 in the upper corner to 1973. Again, it's largely I suppose what you call a big box site at the moment, but tremendous potential with large parking lots and with the subway coming, the streetcar coming down the middle, this enormous potential for densification and sort of redevelopment. So there's again, just reminding of the street as it's going to be in the future, showing the existing conditions along either side. Some of our analysis on the site, sort of looking at ways of breaking down the fabric of the site by introducing in orange new streets or pedestrian ways that start to cut down on the lot size, but pay heed to the fact that these are existing sites and that this is a fabric that will be developed in an evolutionary sense, redeveloped mostly by the property owners themselves. A sort of larger, very large scale planning notion. So Eglinton's at the top there, sort of mixed use along their new workspace or employment space in red in the middle, and that mixed use perimeter. Patterns of land division and how that could happen over time. So I think, again, this is a very key part of the project is how do you plan for the time element of this, and how do you learn from the Young line and the Bloor line, for example, and the St. Clair line more recently. And then developing block types that aren't necessarily all high-rise, but actually involve a variety of scales, from duplexes and quadruplexes, villas, if I can call them that, to mid-rise to higher density. So we actually create a mix of affordability and a mix of incomes that are encouraged to come. Again, these all could take much larger explanation I simply don't have time for, but these are all sort of block types that we developed that could evolve over time in this place. So there's a look in sort of midstream of evolution. Yeah, there's an existing building still in the middle, and buildings of either side have been developed. So we're now thinking of implementation, and that, just to give you a sense of that, really what's going to happen here is that the line itself will be put in, and the land around the stations will be developed first. So those are the dots. Well, those are the pieces of street that would be developed with each station. So there's a kind of, it starts really around the station and then grows out in between stations over time, is the notion. And these are drawings that we did that kind of looked at how that evolution, I'm sorry, they're far too big to really see in detail, but how that evolution might happen over time and density. So you can see, for example, at Yonge and Eglinton, the very tall buildings on the right side, and we see the other taller sites as they evolve at Dufferin and Caledonia, Bayview, and the interstitial spaces filling in between. So I think I'm just going to end with some reflections on where we stand in the process and what the challenges that remain are. The last time I was here, in fact, the last series, I think before this, if I'm right, Don, sort of focused on the whole notion of utopia versus agency. So the sort of utopian planning ideas versus real life, and how does real life happen. And I think that's a very relevant issue here, which has not really been explored in a lot of detail. It's fine to talk about mid-rise density zoning being applied over strips of land, but if it can't be realized on a property-by-property basis, it means that entire blocks have to be assembled. And I can assure you, once they're assembled, developers are not going to want to build mid-rise. So there'd be enormous pressure to then. So I think one of the big issues is how are we going to empower individual landowners and small builders to participate in the process? And that is not clear yet. And I think it is certainly an area that we're extremely interested in how that can happen. And we're actually working on that kind of independently at the moment, because I don't think it really did get addressed in the project as itself. So how can incremental growth be planned for and encouraged? So how can, I think basically, and I talked about this in the talk I gave here then, we're really at a really interesting point here in history. The first half of the 20th century developed on a largely, it used to be a bad term. You weren't allowed to use it as a plan or piecemeal basis. And I refer you again to The Unplanned Suburbs, a remarkable book by Richard Harris, which talks about how Toronto grew in that period. And it was on a property-by-property basis with individuals having a significant input. In 1950, we got planning, full-out planning. And if you remember, I talk about, and the whole idea of planning was an idea that you knew the answer and you planned for a product. In fact, Don Mills, the deeds that Don Mills created contained 3 colors that you could paint your house because they were all sort of orchestrated and people paid for that. So it was a place that couldn't change. And I believe, generally speaking, since 2006, we're going back to a whole period where we kind of combine critical planning and catalytic planning for infrastructure with the ability to encourage cities to grow and prosper on an incremental basis, property by property, not to exclude developers. There will be still assembly go on. And just to remind us of that, so here's just some of the sort of put that in visualize. So here's Eglinton in 1954 to 1973, the great high-rise clusters that accompanied the subway in the beginning. In some respects, those helped pay for the subway because lands that were used for construction sites that were used in the assembly period for the railway land, for the subway lands, were actually sold off by the city after the fact. But so aside from, in addition to those clusters, and St. Clair was much the same, but a little more spread out. And there is St. Clair in 1954, so looking south. So this is the subway behind Yonge Street at that point and in an open cut. And you got this remarkable thing now where you've still got properties that were developed by the individuals along there through that period and properties that are being redeveloped. So there's an extraordinary mix that's gone on. And there's still that extraordinary DNA, as I would call it, of Main Street being 2-story buildings that hangs on and is hanging on tenaciously over much of Yonge Street, over certainly most of Bloor Street, and over much of St. Clair as well. So it's something we have to consider. But there are, unfortunately I don't have the series of this, but this is a very interesting thing that Spiga started off as a small bakery on the left-hand side of that building. And the first thing they did over the first 10 years is buy the shops alongside. And they've just then they built up the first stage of their apartments, and then they just completed the second stage. So this is a whole project that's developed incrementally by a landowner over a period of 20 years, which I think is quite interesting, as opposed to, and not against, somebody who bought one lot and because they had an extraordinary deep lot, developed a condo beside these other uses. So I think the challenge is, how do we actually encourage this to happen in an orderly way, but in a way that allows the property owners to capture value themselves along with the developers. St. Clair, and I gather some of you are studying it, is a wonderful example. The old street, and we can watch how it evolves generally with the zoning, and I think Pam Blais spoke about that zoning, so I'm not going to go over it, but there's some very interesting, and this was the first subway streetcar in Toronto that was city put in to go out from Yonge Street out to serve the Kodak plant originally, and the second one was from Yonge Street out to serve the Goodyear Tire in the south of Etobicoke. So these are all buildings that were built over time by individuals. You can see already the impact of the streetcar stop is immediately Tim Hortons is there on the smaller scale. Antoine and I did a wonderful project in Paris at one time in one of the neighborhoods there that had run down, and they wanted to spend $6 million putting in a new subway through it to kind of revivify it. What we found out that it had the highest point in Paris is there, and you could actually see the whole city from there. So we made a bus that ran up to there, and then showed how the bus stations themselves would evolve, would spark redevelopment, because with a bus, as soon as you put a bus stop in, the newspapers come. As soon as the newspapers there's a coffee shop. As soon as there's a coffee shop, there's a shoe repair. As soon as there's a shoe repair, et cetera, et cetera. So you can actually catalyze this development, which is already starting to happen on its own here. Renovation, of course, is happening, but here we see some of the older types of density, again on a property-by-property basis. Some really interesting corner types that were evolved in the 40s. But again, all built piece by piece. And we did some work on this just to say that it's not all thinking. We submitted a scheme for the Pan Am Village, which tried to build on the idea of Front Street and it extending into the village itself by analyzing the Front Street itself, the datums, the various datum lines that defined it, anthropologically, if I can call it that, or systematically, using those datum lines to define new building profiles within the village that could be built by individual developers. It happens that the buildings are getting built by 3 developers to look like they were built by many developers, but we were trying to be genuine in our proposal, so that you would create a series of buildings that, in fact, could form a street wall in the long run, but could be developed on an individual basis. So there is our zoning diagram of how that could happen. That's obviously, the Dutch have been onto this for some time, and these are streets and places that are made property by property with some very simple rules. So I think it can be done. And I was just talking with Antoine this week, and he told me there's a new rule in Paris, which I thought was fantastic and might be relevant here, is that Paris has just announced that every property in Paris can build an additional 40 square meters of space as of right. So they're actually freeing all property owners to start to build again themselves, which I think is indicative of the way the world's changing. What a wonderfully simple way to kick that off. And what would we do? How about we do that here? You know, it would be fantastic. Mid-rise is happening, again, as Pam told you, and I think it can happen and will happen. But you notice that it's by already high buildings, so it was fitting in with an existing situation. I think, finally, I'll just end up that I think that one of the shortcomings of the work that's been done today is just looking at the street itself. In fact, the street serves a kilometer. It really is the main street for communities that extend a kilometer on either side, thinking that the next streets up and down are 2 kilometers away. So you're actually serving an entire band to the city. And I feel that the city's got an obligation to be thinking about the impact of this street on that band as a whole. And there it is, in part. So that these are just diagrams that we tabled some time ago that looked at the connections from the street. So, for instance, if there are 500,000 people living on that street, they're going to have children, they're going to want to use the schools back in the neighborhood, they're going to want to use the parks. So it's a two-way movement back and forth in the street. It's not all just coming to the street. And parking is another tool we could use to actually start to spread growth and influence a broader area. So that's also something that I hope that begins to be considered more seriously as we move into serious implementation of the project. And these would be simple moves to make, but take advantage of the impact on the larger fabric. That's my talk. Thank you very much.
So first of all, John, thank you very much. No, don't go away, John. You have to stay up there. John, as some of you may or may not know, is a very passionate man about cities. And it's actually my honor to be the provocateur on John's presentation, because John and I have had very many passionate discussions on a lot of city issues. So I'm delighted to know that John gets terrified. The first thing, John, I'd like to ask, in the case of the Eglinton Connects, what you present is almost a 2-year process, and what you're presenting is the conclusion of that.
Yeah.
And in the case, your firm your client was the city, but at a piece of infrastructure, the scale of which this is, $5 billion, there are more than one client.
Right.
And as the architect, the planner, the idea maker, tell us how you drive to the point of the idea realizing, and tell us how you deal when in fact you see maybe this idea or a version of this idea is not going to fly, or it is going to fly. Tell us how that process unfolds, because I think it'll be interesting for the students to understand that as much as what you're representing is how, is kind of like, John, why did it take 2 years to get here? I mean, I could have done those drawings in a studio. I had a few all-nighters, and there I am. So can you help folks understand that? Because I think the process is so critical.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say right off that there are a series of clients. I mean, the TTC, Metrolinx, the city, and others. And we actually proposed early on, and you'll probably remember this, Leslie, that one of the great successes of the T3, in fact, that Antoine had, which we learned from and went, is that Antoine insisted that all the parties get into a single building and work on the project together there. And we actually try to propose that at the earliest stage of this, because I think it would have been the right thing to do, to work in one place and to exchange back and forth. For instance, you'll see we've got very little information on we had very little involvement with the stations here, which are critical. And we sort of were pushing the envelope to even show them and show the space around them. So so I think that's the question of getting in the same room and working together. How will we move from where we are now to implementation or to realizing it? Again, I think we're working on the as somebody said, the ongoing incompletion of the city. So actually, Eglinton is looking after itself already. We don't need to think that it's dead. It's actually changing as we talk. There are already properties exchanging and buying and exchanging hands for, you can be sure of it. And we're simply going to we're actually in the process of catching up with that, is what I would say. So I don't for a moment think the place is frozen. I acknowledge that it's going to take, because we're on the government side or working on the government side, it's going to take time to catch up with it. But hopefully by then the zoning will be such that, the zoning and the pieces of street that I think will get built. I mean, I think it's going to be 2020, I believe, when the line opens. So we actually have been trying to suggest from the city's point of view, there are things they could be doing right away, pieces that could go into, that aren't going to be touched during the construction of especially on the areas above the street. So I think there are things that could happen right now, but it's not ultimately I'm not going to be able to demand that. I mean, we're suggesting there are ways of, that whole incremental drawing was about exactly how to do that. So, for instance, we already know where the stations are. We could already be setting up signs that these will be the stations, so people live in the area start to understand. We could mock them up. I mean, I use the Melvin Charney example where the great piece of work he did on Sherbrooke Street in Montreal, where he mocked up what the street had been and what it could be. We could be doing that. We could be doing some proactive things to give people a sense. It's taken a long time because not everybody understands how the city became the way it is. And a lot of this was actually working with people and there was huge involvement from neighborhoods and permanent offices out there. So people could begin to understand that, we made walks of Yonge Street with before and after pictures that people were flabbergasted to see. They had no idea that this is what it was like in 55 and 60 to show that change. So I'm babbling here, but it's already going on. We're probably behind the ball a bit. We'll catch up with them, and I would suggest we could be doing things in the interim that could be really conducive to encouraging some of the ideas we have.
Thank you. So one of the other things, John, I think you make the case that in the continuum of self-organizing cities and instant, complete fabric house a la Haussmann, there's a place in the middle that's about being the city catalyst or an urban catalyst.
Yeah.
And in that case, in the case of self-organizing, time is there is no time. It's a zero. Mm-hmm. In the case of the other end of the continuum, it's instant. So everybody wants everything built complete
Yeah.
this concept of complete streets, I have a bit of a challenge, not because
Yeah.
we don't need it, but everyone thinks you just add water and
If it's
poof, up it
complete,
comes.
if it's complete, it's dead.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But this idea of the catalyst, tell me how you reconcile that idea to determine how much is too much in terms of what you prescribe as an urban designer and a planner with an economic system that really, and how to pay for all this stuff is why now I'm getting back to
Right.
how do you pay for it. An economic system that is actually more akin to the complete project. So
Okay, well, I think...
we fund things because politicians agree to pay for projects that they have certainty the money is going to deliver an end product. The catalyst model sort of infers that put a little money here and then keep putting money on and on and on, and you will get what you need. Tell me a little bit about how because that takes a lot of convincing to a lot of people to believe that's how we should go.
It's a difficult... I actually use the prairies as an example. So the prairies, you know, at least I certainly thought that there were two trains just racing across there to get to Vancouver. I never asked what was in Vancouver. And there was something in 1870. But actually what happened is those companies sent out an agronomist in front of them to go and study Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba to find out where the wheat would grow so they'd know where to put the train, which is a kind of awakening thing. The first agronomist that went out was a very famous guy called Palliser. And he went out in a drought year and he went across the Southern Railroad, and came back and said, you'll never grow wheat. It's impossible. It's a desert. Forget it. And 2 years later, the other company said, no, you know, maybe if we moved a little bit north. And in fact, they did move out of the desert belt. And the agronomist went out and he came back and said, here's where you put the train. So the train line was set. He said, well, we got to pick up the wheat. So we got to build elevators. Now, they harvest wheat in October. So we got to make sure that a truck can get to the farthest farm and back to that elevator in light in October. And that made a dimension of 4 kilometers. And so the elevators are 8 kilometers apart. Maybe it's 6, I've forgotten. And then somebody said, well, the train's going to be stopping there. People are going to want to get off and stay. And these are towns. So they took a standard town plan, little town plan, and dropped it at every elevator. And that's all they did. That was so some of those little towns became Swift Current or Medicine Hat or Calgary, or some of them are still tiny little places, some of them never developed. So I think that what the public sector is responsible for here is what you're doing is putting the LRT in. I think they're responsible for the public realm itself. I think that, and I would be looking at trying to establish that not in pieces, but right from the beginning in a way that could layer up on it as the tax base increased alongside. If it isn't increasing, then the public realm's not increasing. And then I think it's up to us to set some basic rules for development, heights. Just, I mean, being able to add 40 square meters would be part of that. But I think just depicting the heights, you could go to, people will, like Spiga, they'll figure it out.
So are you saying, therefore, then it's okay for parts to fail? I mean, meaning,
yeah.
You know, you put the conditions in place for
Yeah.
what you think can happen, but time comes along and it's okay that certain aspects won't evolve. Some will be more successful.
Yeah,
we should expect that some will be more successful than others.
We not only expect it, we know the Young Line and the Bloor Line, they're big peaks. I mean, just on Young between Dundas and College, which is it's just now, I mean, Sam the Record Man just came down.
50 years later.
Yeah. It doesn't mean it was unsuccessful. It'll always be. I don't know where is it run down.
So that's a major. I mean, very few people think like that, John. I mean, right. in public decision making, like politicians don't think like that. They're operating in 4-year cycles. Investments are happening in cycles.
Yeah, but let's remember. So they said the planners said to us. I'm a planner, by the way. But in 1950, they said, leave the old city, and we're going to build. I showed this last time. There were 7 satellites around the city. Don Mills is the perfect example. And in fact, what happened is, quickly, they were all supposed to be low density, bungalows. And so that was good for about 35% of the population. But they didn't want to work in the factories that were set up around there. They were already going downtown or whatever. So they had to build then Thorncliffe and Flemington to accommodate the other 65. And now that belt that we expanded into between 1950 and 2000 is the poverty belt of Toronto. So that didn't work. And if I go back to Eglinton West and the inner city, where we still have far too many rules, but lawyers have figured out how to get around, it's still dynamic and growing. And so I don't, it's diversity. It's a hard sell because we're still stuck on, we have some utopian view.
So let me, because it's only fair because I got this question last time. You should get this question. The cities of Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge have plans for a light rapid transit corridor. Right. What advice, having now gone through this whole exercise, they're about the same point we are in Toronto on the Eglinton line. They've gone through a lot of public debate. What's your advice to the mayors of Kitchener, Waterloo, and the grand burghers of the region of Waterloo as they advance the infrastructure in terms of what they should be thinking about from a city building standpoint?
Yeah. I don't think there's anything that I said before.
Any politicians in the room before he answers the question?
Yeah. I don't mind. Focus on the public realm, the whole public realm, and focus on the rules, the zoning rules, and how to make fewer rules but more effective rules than we've had in the past, I think is the key. And use your public investments along the line to demonstrate what you think should happen. What I mean by that is there are lots of public institutional sites along those lines that are actually going to be built by public agencies, and they should be built to represent the models, to model up the answers, the solutions that could be reached in other places. So, and don't expect that it's all going to happen overnight, and celebrate the fact that, as I said last time, and it's a quote from Le Corbusier, it's always life that's right and architecture and planning that are wrong. And let catalyze life, give it a place, give it an expression. So.
Am I done?
I think we
Okay.
did. This wraps up a series. We're starting to plan next year's. It's a flight of fancy right now. It will be somewhere else. I wanted to thank John and Leslie for curating with me this series, for projecting their own participation into it, and for sort of taking this on. And now I'm going to make one commercial point. Just starting in a week, first year is going to start working with how to pick the smallest increments on St. Clair to develop as mid-rise. Because it seems to me that a place like this is one of the only places where we can afford to do the kind of research that would actually say, you can have that agency because you can actually discover configurations, techniques, strategies, forms. You can make it possible.
I think the key is analyzing the DNA of St. Clair. I value working in St. Clair West. It would be great. I'd love to come back and see that. Really analyze, understand the rules that are at play now.
Yeah.
Which aren't official rules, they're informal rules. And multiply.
First year you heard that. We'll repeat it later. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you for attendance in this entire enterprise. Have a good night.